Theater versus Permanent. The Complex Truth of Rank Promotions and Demotions under Patton, November 1944. A rear echelon personnel office in Nancy, France. A thick layer of frost coats the window panes, and coal smoke fills the cramped, heated room. Clerks type on heavy black machines, filling out ledgers, filing reports, and organizing stacks of paper. The steady clicking of the keys stops when a dirty, exhausted soldier walks through the door, his boots tracking frozen mud onto the pristine wooden floor. He presents his paybook to the clerk, expecting a simple signature to match his new rank. Instead, he receives a cold refusal. The clerk points a finger at the soldier's collar and demands that he strip off his officer insignia immediately. A safe, comfortable bureaucrat decides to erase a battlefield promotion with a single stroke of a pen. But General George S. Patton is on his way to this office, and his response will turn the pristine room upside down. This is the story of what happened when old hierarchies met new realities in a rear echelon office, where a soldier's hard-earned battlefield commission was stripped away by a stroke of a pen, until an unexpected commander intervened. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. First Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Riker was 25 years old. Born and raised in the soot-choked air of a steel mill neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he belonged to the 5th Infantry Division, an outfit that had seen some of the most unforgiving combat across Western Europe. Riker was not a career military man, nor did he have influential family connections back home. He had worked the grueling shifts at the mill, handling molten iron, before enlisting right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war had cost him dearly. He had lost his closest childhood friend at Normandy and carried a jagged piece of shrapnel in his left thigh from a mortar blast outside Metz. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke of his deeds, but his actions spoke for him. During a brutal firefight against an entrenched enemy position, he single-handedly crawled through frozen mud, charged a German machine gun nest, and knocked it out, saving his pinned-down squad. That act of raw courage earned him a direct battlefield commission, signed on a makeshift table by the Army commander himself. Now, he stood inside the warm personnel office, an exhausted combat veteran holding a paybook that meant his family might receive a slightly larger check. Major Arthur Pendleton was 42 years old, hailing from an affluent suburb in Boston, Massachusetts, and served as the administrative personnel adjutant for the sector. He looked at the war not through the sights of an M1 Garand rifle, but through the neat columns of military regulation books. To Pendleton, the conflict was an administrative challenge that required absolute clerical discipline. He famously believed that armies did not win battles through chaotic heroism, but through flawless filing systems and proper, unhurried documentation. He had never seen a single enemy soldier, nor had he ever heard the terrifying sound of incoming artillery fire. His daily routine revolved around the safe, warm comfort of the rear headquarters, where his boots remained free of mud and his tailored uniform stayed perfectly pressed. He possessed a pristine, mahogany desk organized with geometric precision, featuring stacks of carbon paper and shiny silver inkwells. He viewed the dirty, shell-shocked combat troops who drifted into his office as an annoyance, unrefined men who disrupted his clean ledgers and lacked proper respect for the chain of command. By November 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had slowed to a grueling frozen crawl. The rapid dash that followed the breakout from Normandy during the summer months was over. Now, the American forces faced a bitter winter, severe supply shortages, and a deeply entrenched, desperate German defense. Frontline infantry divisions were taking heavy casualties in the muddy trenches of eastern France, fighting for yards of frozen ground rather than whole cities. In these conditions, battlefield casualties left massive gaps in the chain of command, forcing senior commanders to promote capable non-commissioned officers on the spot to maintain unit cohesion and leadership during combat. These battlefield commissions were common practice, designed to reward immediate bravery and keep combat units functioning when communication with higher headquarters was impossible. Most frontline commanders recognized these field promotions instantly, prioritizing the survival of their men over bureaucratic procedures. However, the vast American military apparatus stretching across the Atlantic had created a massive gulf between the men who fought the war and the men who managed the paperwork, deep in the rear echelons. Far removed from the artillery shells and the freezing mud, a massive network of administrative offices had sprouted up in liberated cities like Nancy. These offices were populated by career bureaucrats who had never spent a single night in a frozen foxhole. They viewed the conflict not as a life or death struggle, but as a giant corporate ledger that needed to be balanced perfectly. Many high-ranking officers in the rear regularly allowed clerical errors and missing forms to delay vital supplies, equipment, and pay, preferring to let frontline soldiers suffer rather than bypass military regulations. The stage was set for a collision between these two separate worlds. Inside the warm, quiet office, Riker walked up to the reception counter and placed his canvas paybook onto the smooth surface. The clerk looked down from his high wooden stool, adjusted his glasses, and flicked a speck of dust from his sleeve. He opened the small booklet, glanced at the newly stamped entry, and shook his head with a look of pure boredom. He stated that the promotion could not be processed because the permanent authorization forms from Washington were completely missing in triplicate. Riker leaned against the wooden counter, exhaling a long breath, and explained that General Patton had personally given him the rank in the field 3 days ago, during a brutal firefight. The clerk slid the booklet back across the wood and retorted that a field promotion was merely a temporary theater arrangement until the real paperwork arrived from across the ocean. Riker slammed his calloused hand onto the counter, stating that his men were freezing in the trenches right now, and that he needed his proper pay processed so he could send it back to his family in Pittsburgh. The commotion brought Major Pendleton stepping out from his inner private office, his freshly polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the clean floorboards. He looked at Riker with cold disdain, adjusted the sharp crease of his wool trousers, and asked what the shouting was about in his administration room. The clerk reported that the sergeant was demanding a lieutenant's pay grade, based entirely on an unverified field signature. Riker stepped forward, saluted stiffly, and told the major that the signature belonged to the army commander, written while German machine guns were tearing their platoon apart. Pendleton smiled thinly, crossed his arms over his chest, and stated that frontline chaos did not dictate the strict regulatory laws of the United States Army. He told Riker that without the proper carbon copies filed in the central repository, the battlefield promotion was completely invalid. Riker stared at the officer, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion, and asked if the major expected him to return to the freezing front line as a sergeant after earning those bars in the mud. Pendleton leaned over the desk, looked down at Riker's soiled boots, and answered that he was ordering him to strip those silver insignia bars off his collar right now before leaving the building. He remarked that wars were won through perfect administrative order and disciplined filing, not by unrefined infantrymen playing at being officers. Riker remained silent for a long moment, realizing that his blood-earned rank meant nothing to the man standing behind the desk. He told the major that he would not remove the bars that his men had watched him earn. Pendleton frowned deeply, grabbed his silver pen, and stated that refusal to obey a direct order from a superior logistics officer would result in an immediate court-martial. The major turned back toward his desk to draft the disciplinary charges. The administrative clerk watched the exchange with a smug smile, confident that the rules of the rear echelon had triumphed over the realities of the front lines. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. His tall frame filled the doorway, his polished leather boots tracking frozen mud directly onto the clean wooden floorboards. The sudden silence in the room was absolute as every clerk froze over their machines. Patton studied him. He looked at the major's immaculate uniform, and then turned his gaze to the dirt-covered sergeant. Patton asked Pendleton, who signed the promotion order in the soldier's paybook. Pendleton stammered that it appeared to be the Army commander's signature, but lacked permanent Washington authorization forms. Patton asked if the major considered an Army commander's signature invalid in a combat zone. Pendleton answered that regulations required documentation in triplicate to prevent clerical errors. Patton asked the major if he had ever been shot at while filling out his ledger. Pendleton swallowed hard and answered, "No, sir. You think this war is won with carbon paper and sharp creases. You sit in this warm room, surrounded by inkwells and filing cabinets, believing that your regulations are what keeps the Army moving forward. You look down on the men who come into your office with mud on their boots and blood on their uniforms because they do not fit into your neat columns. The signature in that book is mine. I gave this man his bars because he earned them in the frozen mud while you were keeping your hands clean. He charged a machine gun nest to save his platoon, performing the real work of an officer while you performed the duties of a clerk. A battlefield commission is not a clerical error to be erased by a bureaucrat with a silver pen. It is a binding promise made to the men who bleed in the trenches. When a commander gives a man authority in the field, that authority stands above any filing system in Washington. You have a choice. You will personally type out a permanent field commission for this man right now, or you will face an immediate court-martial for insubordination and interfering with combat operations. Decide now." Pendleton bowed his head. His face turning completely pale, he sat down at the nearest typewriter, his hands shaking so violently he could barely strike the keys. The sound of heavy, rapid typing filled the room as Pendleton struck the metal keys of the typewriter, his fingers slipping twice against the slick glass keys. Patton stood directly behind his chair, his shadow falling across the blank paper as the ink ribbon slowly unspooled. The finished document was ripped from the roller, leaving a sharp tear across the page, and pressed flat under Patton's thumb for a quick ink signature. The general handed the paper directly to Riker, then turned his gaze back to the pale adjutant. Patton ordered his personal military police escort to strip the clean wool jacket from the major's shoulders, right into the public administrative space. 2 guards stepped forward, unhooking Pendleton's silver lapel pins and throwing his polished gear into an empty canvas duffel bag. The clerks watched in absolute silence as their immaculate superior officer was handed a frozen, stiff wool overcoat and a standard-issue trench shovel. Patton ordered the immediate transfer of the major to a forward aid station located outside the defensive perimeter, where the ground was frozen solid. He was commanded to spend the next 14 days digging deep latrine pits for the arriving casualties, performing manual labor in the freezing cold so he could see the exact cost of the security he enjoyed behind his pristine desk. Thomas Riker returned to Pittsburgh after the war ended, arriving home in the late autumn of 1945. He walked back into the steel mills, working the same grueling shifts he had before the conflict began, though the jagged shrapnel in his thigh made the long hours on the concrete floor incredibly painful. He raised a family, rarely spoke to his children about the freezing trenches of eastern France, and kept his silver lieutenant bars locked inside a small wooden box in his dresser drawer. He lived a quiet, hard-working life until his death in 1982, remembered by his neighbors as a gentle man who never boasted about his courage. Arthur Pendleton returned to Massachusetts after his discharge in 1946, but the 2 weeks spent digging latrines in the frozen mud of the front lines had broken his spirit completely. He attempted to resume his career as an administrative executive, but his former confidence was gone, replaced by a bitter resentment toward the frontline veterans who now flooded the civilian workforce. He lived a solitary existence in his quiet suburban home, surrounded by neatly organized files that no one else cared to read, until he passed away in 1974. He never forgave the military system for treating his regulatory expertise with such public humiliation. Patton never recorded the incident in his official reports, viewing the confrontation as a minor administrative correction rather than a significant event. He mentioned the encounter only once in a private letter to his wife, noting that some men simply required a spade and frozen ground to understand the true nature of command. Some historians have argued that Patton's public humiliation of rear echelon officers undermined the strict administrative discipline necessary to sustain a massive global war machine. creating unnecessary friction between essential logistics networks and frontline combat troops. They contend that adherence to regulations was vital for preventing widespread chaotic structural errors across the Atlantic. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that his harsh, theatrical interventions were completely necessary to preserve the crumbling morale of combat soldiers who were routinely sacrificed by safe, unyielding bureaucrats. What is certain is that Patton's absolute refusal to allow clerical procedures to invalidate real battlefield achievements established a permanent precedent across the European theater, reinforcing the concept that authority earned through combat command held a higher moral weight than any rear echelon ledger. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have allowed the military bureaucracy to follow its official procedures? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.